Today, there are over 8 billion humans living on Earth. Cities glow at night, planes cross the sky, satellites circle overhead. We've built a world so bright that darkness almost feels like a choice. But there was a time when darkness wasn't a metaphor. It was real. Imagine waking up at noon and seeing the sun, pale and weak, like a dying candle behind grey clouds that never clear. Imagine living in a world where summer feels like winter, where crops fail for years, and where even the most powerful empires crumble because the sky itself has turned against them. This actually happened. In the year 536, something blotted out the Sunday. For more than a decade, daylight dimmed, harvests died, and millions starved. And then came the plague. Cities emptied. Forests swallowed farms. Historians call it the worst time to be alive, and they're not exaggerating. The entire world seemed to break at once. If you're watching this at night, maybe getting ready to fall asleep, just imagine what it felt like to wake up in a world where the sun no longer rose the way it used to. Because that's where our story begins, in the century when the world went dark and humanity almost didn't make it back to the light. Imagine it's the middle of the day, the year is 536, and the sun simply stops shining the way it's supposed to. The sky isn't cloudy, there's no storm, but the light turns strange, dim and cold, as if someone pulled a curtain across the heavens. Farmers stop working and stare upward in silence. Birds grow quiet, shadows vanish. Noon begins to feel like twilight. Across Europe and Asia, people look up and whisper that maybe the world is ending. You wake up and the sun is there, but weak, pale, almost sick. For months, it never looks right. Mornings are grey, evenings are darker, and even when it should be summer, frost clings to the ground. Crops begin to fail. Fruit withers before ripening. The air feels wrong, heavy with dust that glows faintly when light filters through. No one knows it yet, but this is the beginning of what scientists today call the most catastrophic decade in recorded history. Ancient writers struggled to describe it. In Constantinople, a historian named Procopius wrote that the sun gave forth its light without brightness, like the moon during an eclipse. In Ireland, monks recorded that bread was scarce. In China, summer snow fell on the fields. No one understood that the cause was volcanic ash high in the atmosphere from eruptions so massive that they dimmed the entire planet. To the people living through it, this wasn't science. It was punishment. It was terror. It was the end of everything familiar. Imagine trying to light a fire that barely warms you because the air itself feels colder than usual. Imagine fields of wheat turning yellow too soon, not from ripeness, but from death. Imagine nights that stretch endlessly because even the days look like dusk. The feeling that the world has been tilted into some new, darker order. People prayed, fasted, made sacrifices. Some fled their villages searching for warmth that no longer existed. Others stayed and watched their animals die, one by one. It wasn't just hunger, it was confusion. The sun was the one constant in every life, every belief system, every story ever told. When it failed, it felt like the rules of nature had collapsed. In less than a year, temperatures dropped across the northern hemisphere by nearly 3 degrees. That might not sound like much, but it was enough to destroy harvests and freeze rivers that had never frozen before. This single moment in history became a chain reaction of disasters that would last for more than a century. Famines followed the cold, then came plague, empires weakened, populations fell. The memory of this dim decade echoed in myths about dark suns and cursed skies for generations. We remember wars and inventions and kings, but the world we live in today was shaped just as much by the years when the light went out. The year 536 wasn't just a bad time to be alive. It was the absolute worst. How do you measure the worst time to be alive? It sounds like an impossible question, because every century has its disasters, its wars, its moments when survival feels like a miracle. But when historians and scientists try to identify the absolute low point in human history, they don't look for just one big tragedy. They look for when everything went wrong all at once. Not just death, but the feeling that the world itself was broken. To measure misery, you start by asking how far it reached. A local famine can destroy a city, but a global event can reshape civilization. The year 536 wasn't just a regional problem. It affected people from Ireland to China, from the Arctic Circle to the deserts of Africa. Tree rings from across the northern hemisphere show the same story, a sudden and massive drop in growth, the mark of years when sunlight faded and temperatures fell. This wasn't one nation's curse. It was a planet-wide collapse. Then there's duration. A bad year can be endured, but when disaster lasts for more than a decade, it doesn't just hurt individuals, it erases generations. The darkness of the 6th century stretched from 536 well into the 540s, and even longer in some regions. For over 10 years, children were born into cold summers and grey skies, and entire lifetimes began and ended without ever seeing a normal Sunday. Mortality is another measure, but counting the dead from 15 centuries ago is nearly impossible. What we can measure instead is what disappeared. Settlements abandoned, fields turned back to forest, populations in Europe, Asia, and Africa that shrank dramatically. Archaeologists see gaps in layers of human activity, literal holes in history, where people simply stopped building, stopped trading, stopped living. Famine doesn't just kill the body, it breaks communities. It teaches people to hoard instead of share, to fear their neighbours instead of trust them. And famine wasn't the only killer. When the cold weakened immune systems and hunger drove migration, disease followed. The Justinian plague, that erupted just a few years later, was the final blow. A pandemic that erased tens of millions of lives already strained by hunger and despair. Society collapses in stages. First the harvests fail, then trade stops, then governments lose control. The 6th century saw all of that. Gold coins grew smaller, armies deserted, empires once powerful enough to rule continents were suddenly begging for grain shipments. Even faith wavered. When the sun itself seemed to die, prayers began to sound like echoes in an empty sky. The final measure of misery is psychological, the way people understood their own suffering. Imagine being born into a world where your parents tell you that the sun used to shine bright and warm, but you have never seen it that way, that the stories of summer fields and full harvests sound like fairy tales. That's what it means for a generation to live inside an apocalypse. The worst time to be alive wasn't just about bodies buried or cities burned, it was about the collapse of hope itself. There are moments when the earth itself seems to turn against life, when nature reminds us that it can rewrite the rules of existence in an instant. One of the most terrifying ways it does that is through volcanoes. We tend to think of eruptions as local disasters, a mountain blowing apart, a river of fire, a sky filled with smoke. But sometimes an eruption is so powerful it changes the entire planet. Imagine one explosion filling the air with so much ash that sunlight can't reach the ground. The air cools, the rains fail, crops die, and winter arrives in the middle of summer. This is what scientists call a volcanic winter, and it has happened before. In the year 1815, a volcano called Mount Tambora erupted in what is now Indonesia. It was the most powerful eruption in recorded history. The blast was heard over 1,000 miles away. It shot billions of tons of ash and sulfur into the upper atmosphere, creating a blanket that dimmed sunlight across the world. The next year was remembered as the year without a summer. In Europe, frost hit in June, snow fell in July, rivers froze in August, crops failed, famine spread, and people starved. In North America, skies turned a strange orange-grey, and the sun looked like a dull red coin. Thousands died, millions suffered, all from one mountain tearing itself apart. But even Tambora was small compared to what Earth has done before. 74,000 years ago, the Toba supervolcano erupted in what is now Sumatra. It left a crater 70 miles wide and released enough ash to cover entire continents. For years afterward, the planet was plunged into a volcanic winter so severe that scientists believe it nearly wiped out early humans. Genetic studies suggest our species dropped to just a few thousand individuals. Humanity survived, but barely. The skies must have looked alien, the days dim and colourless, the nights endless. It was the kind of catastrophe that burned itself into memory and myth, the reason so many ancient stories speak of darkness swallowing the world. When the year 536 arrived, people didn't know it yet, but they were about to experience something similar. Somewhere on Earth, maybe in Iceland, maybe in North America, maybe in the tropics, a volcano erupted with unimaginable force. The explosion filled the atmosphere with microscopic ash and sulfuric droplets that circled the globe, turning the sky a strange silvery grey. For more than a year, sunlight weakened. The temperature fell, crops withered, famines began. The pattern fits the signature of a volcanic winter, one so devastating that even centuries later, scientists could see its traces in ice cores, frozen layers of ash trapped deep within glaciers. Every line of evidence points to a world wrapped in shadow, a year when noon looked like evening and the horizon glowed faintly like dying embers. The people of the 6th century had no idea what caused it. They only knew that the sun had betrayed them, that their world had turned cold and silent, and that survival itself was about to become the hardest test humanity had ever faced. The year 536 began like any other, but within months it became the moment when the sun itself seemed to die. Across Europe, Asia, and the Middle East, people looked up and saw a sky that had lost its colour. The light was faint and ghostly, the air thick and strange. Even at noon, the sun shone like a dull copper disk. Shadows disappeared. The warmth that should have come with spring never arrived. Cold winds swept across fields that should have been green, and frost bit into crops that had just begun to grow. In Constantinople, the historian Procopius wrote that the sun gave forth its light without brightness, as if in permanent eclipse. He wasn't exaggerating. For 18 months, daylight never returned to normal. In Ireland, monks recorded that bread was scarce. In China, snow fell in summer and crops failed. From the Mediterranean to the Pacific, the same eerie pattern appeared. It was as if a veil had been drawn over the world. Scientists today know that this was likely caused by a massive volcanic eruption, one so powerful that it sent sulfuric dust high into the stratosphere, where it spread across the entire planet. But to the people living through it, there was no explanation. Only fear. The weather went mad. The sky turned a strange bluish grey. The stars at night seemed dimmer, almost smudged by the haze. Seasons lost their rhythm. In some places, it snowed in June. In others, rains came at the wrong time, or not at all. Crops withered in the ground, and food stores began to run out. The temperature dropped by more than 2 degrees, enough to trigger the worst famine Europe and Asia had seen in centuries. Trees stopped growing that year. You can still see it today in their rings, a thin, pale line that marks a moment when life nearly stalled. Imagine living in a village that depended on the harvest to survive. Each morning, you go to the fields, hoping to see signs of recovery, and every day the plants look worse. The leaves are pale, the soil feels hard and cold. You hear rumours from travellers that entire towns are starving, that the roads are filled with people searching for food that doesn't exist. Some believe the gods are angry, others think demons have stolen the Sunday. People light candles at midday because the dim light makes it hard to see indoors. The days blur together in a grey, endless cold. The old calendars and festivals stop making sense because the seasons no longer match the Sunday. By winter, hunger spreads like a shadow across continents. In Constantinople, grain shipments vanish. In Britain, forests begin to reclaim abandoned fields. The world is shrinking into silence. Nobody knows it yet, but this is only the beginning. The year 536 marks the opening chapter of a decade-long catastrophe, a time when nature reminded humanity that it had never been in control. Just when the world began to hope that the darkness of 536 was fading, another disaster struck. It was only a few years later, around 540, when the Earth unleashed a second blow. Somewhere, another volcano erupted, massive enough to fill the atmosphere again with ash and sulfur, blocking sunlight and plunging the world back into cold. For people who had just survived years of hunger and fear, it must have felt like a nightmare returning to life. The first eruption had already weakened societies across Europe and Asia. Fields had failed, trade had slowed, and millions were struggling to rebuild. The second eruption destroyed what little recovery had begun. Temperatures dropped again, this time even lower. Summers were short and bitter, winters long and endless. Crops planted in spring rotted before they could ripen. Entire regions starved. It was as if the planet refused to heal. Scientists who study ancient ice cores can see the evidence clearly. 2 layers of volcanic ash appear within a decade of each other, one from 536 and another from around 540 or 541. The second eruption may have been even stronger, amplifying the cooling effect and extending the crisis for years. But to the people living through it, the science didn't matter. They only knew that the world had lost its balance. Villages emptied, families scattered. The survivors of the first famine were now too weak to plant new crops. Livestock died, and with them went milk, meat, and labor for the fields. The chain of collapse was complete. Empires that had endured for centuries began to falter. The Byzantine Empire, still recovering from war and economic strain, faced food shortages so severe that soldiers deserted and tax systems broke down. In Persia, droughts and failed harvests pushed nomadic tribes to migrate, spreading conflict across the region. In northern Europe, archaeological evidence shows a sudden drop in human activity, as if whole communities vanished. Forests reclaimed farmlands, roads disappeared beneath weeds. It was a slow erasure of civilization. And then came disease. The combination of cold, hunger, and mass movement of people created the perfect breeding ground for what would soon become known as the Plague of Justinian. It appeared in 541, just as the second volcanic winter reached its worst point, striking cities already weakened by years of famine. The darkness in the sky now had a mirror on Earth, invisible but just as deadly. Imagine living through that time. First the sun dims, then the food runs out, then the sickness comes. The feeling of despair must have been impossible to escape. Even religion offered little comfort, because every sign in nature seemed to say that the end had already begun. For more than a decade, the world staggered from one disaster to another. The second eruption sealed the fate of an entire generation. It wasn't just another bad year. It was the moment when humanity's resilience broke, when the planet itself seemed to whisper that survival had a limit. The first sign of collapse wasn't war or fire or plague. It was silence, the kind that settles over a village when the fields stop growing. By the year 541, the ground itself seemed exhausted. Farmers planted their rye and wheat as they always had, but the seeds never took. The soil stayed cold. The rain came late, or not at all. When the crops finally sprouted, they were pale and weak, their roots too shallow to survive the frost that returned even in summer. Harvest season came and went with almost nothing to gather. The grain that did grow was small and bitter. Bread that should have been soft and golden turned grey and hard, like stone. This was what famine looked like. Not an instant disaster, but a slow unravelling of everything people depended on. In a world before trade networks or industrial food supplies, every family relied on what they could grow or store. When one harvest failed, they could survive on last year's grain. When two failed, hunger began. By the third, starvation was everywhere. The livestock that helped plough the fields were slaughtered for food, which meant the next planting season would be even harder. The collapse of agriculture was like a chain reaction. One broken link, and everything else followed. Archaeologists studying this period find signs of it in pollen layers and abandoned fields. Rye, which had been a staple in northern Europe, suddenly disappears from the record. Wheat production crashes in the Mediterranean. Even grasslands vanish from the soil record, replaced by forest growth, proof that farms were abandoned for good. Villages emptied not because people chose to leave, but because they couldn't stay alive. In desperate times, people turned to whatever they could eat: bark from trees, roots and weeds, dried moss ground into flour, anything that could stretch a little bread further. There are stories from later famines where people baked loaves from dirt mixed with grain. It's likely the same happened here. Bread wasn't just food, it was survival. And when even bread failed, the will to keep going began to break. Granaries that once fed entire towns stood empty. Rats and insects picked through the last kernels. Mothers boiled leaves in water to make something warm for their children, knowing it would do nothing to fill their stomachs. The poor scavenged in the ruins of old fields. The rich tried to buy food with gold that had lost its meaning because there was nothing left to trade. Hunger changed people. It made neighbors turn on each other. It made priests question their gods. It made entire regions lose faith in the future. Empires could survive wars, but they couldn't survive empty fields. When bread turned to stone, it wasn't just the end of the harvest. It was the end of stability, the moment when the foundations of civilization crumbled like dust. The world that once thrived on grain had become a world that barely remembered what full felt like. The silence that followed the famines was unlike anything the ancient world had ever known. In the cities of the Mediterranean, markets that once rang with the sound of merchants and metal fell quiet. The air that used to smell of bread and olive oil now smelled of smoke and rot. Ships that once carried spices and grain between continents stayed in harbour, their sails furled, their crews gone. Trade routes that had linked entire civilizations began to fade, like old roads swallowed by the desert. When the crops failed, trade failed with them. Food had always been the foundation of the ancient economy. Grain from Egypt fed Constantinople. Olive oil from Greece lit the lamps of Italy. Tin and copper from the north became coins and tools and weapons. But when harvests collapsed, the flow of goods stopped. Merchants went bankrupt. Artisans lost work. The markets emptied. The hum of urban life turned into a hollow echo. Money itself began to lose meaning. Gold coins were melted down and reminted smaller and thinner. Silver was mixed with cheaper metals. What had once been a symbol of stability now showed the weakness of empire. People no longer trusted that the coins in their hands could buy what they needed, because there was nothing left to buy. The Emperor Justinian tried to keep the cities alive with massive building projects. He ordered new churches, new walls, new monuments. But even the sound of hammers faded as workers grew hungry or fled to the countryside searching for food. In the workshops, the forges went cold. The pottery kilns stopped burning. Textiles that had once been dyed bright colours now appeared in dull, unbleached cloth because the expensive dyes came from far away and no one could afford them anymore. Cities that had been alive with voices began to die slowly. In Rome, streets filled with weeds. In Antioch, earthquakes and famine emptied whole neighbourhoods. In Constantinople, the largest city in the world, the population fell by half within a few years. Northern Europe fared even worse. Small towns along the trade routes connecting the Baltic to the Mediterranean disappeared entirely. The sea froze in places it never had before. Even fishermen abandoned their work because the fish were gone. The economy of the ancient world wasn't built to survive a decade of winter. Everything depended on movement, on exchange, on stability. When one broke, the others fell like dominoes. This was the first global recession, long before anyone used that word. But to the people living through it, it didn't feel like an economic term. It felt like the end of civilization. The lights of the great cities went out one by one until only silence remained. That silence lasted for generations. It was the sound of a world that had forgotten how to trade, how to build, how to grow, waiting in the dark for the sun to return. In the year 541, the world that had already been broken by cold and hunger met something even worse. The plague arrived quietly at first, slipping ashore with rats hidden in sacks of grain carried by ships into the harbours of Egypt. Within weeks, it began its slow crawl across the world. This was the beginning of what would later be called the Justinianic Plague, named after the emperor who ruled during its rise. But to the people who lived through it, it had no name, only terror. The disease spread along trade routes that had once carried wealth and culture, now carrying death. It moved from the ports of Alexandria to the great city of Constantinople, then outward through Syria, Italy, Persia, and beyond. No one understood what was happening. People only knew that the sickness struck fast. Fever, swelling, black sores. Within days, victims were dead. Bodies filled the streets faster than they could be buried. The smell of death hung over entire cities. In Constantinople, chroniclers claimed that 10,000 people were dying every day at the height of the plague. The number might be exaggerated, but the fear was real. Families locked themselves indoors. Priests refused to perform last rites. Ships were left adrift because their crews had perished at sea. In the countryside, villages vanished. Entire regions that had barely survived famine now faced extinction. Farmers who were supposed to bring in the next harvest died before they could reach their fields. Livestock wandered free. Roads grew over with weeds. The few who survived sometimes walked for miles without seeing another living person. Historians believe this was the first true global pandemic. Its reach stretched from the shores of the Mediterranean to the mountains of Iran and as far as the British Isles. The bacteria responsible was the same one that would later cause the Black Death in the 14th century. But this outbreak came 1,000 years earlier, when people were far less prepared. The population of the Byzantine Empire may have dropped by more than half. Entire armies disappeared. Towns that had stood for centuries became ruins overnight. The empire itself, already struggling under famine and war, staggered under the weight of so much death. Justinian himself fell ill but somehow survived, though his empire would never truly recover. The plague didn't end quickly. It came in waves for the next 2 centuries, striking again and again as new generations were born. Children grew up surrounded by loss, never knowing peace or plenty. When they looked at the world around them, they saw ruins and graves where cities used to stand. The plague was more than a disease. It was the final blow in a chain of disasters that had begun with a darkened sky. The world had been growing colder and poorer, and now it was also growing empty. The silence of famine was replaced by the silence of death. For the people of the 6th century, it must have felt like the end of the human story. By the middle of the 6th century, the great empires that had once ruled the known world were barely standing. The Byzantine Empire, the eastern half of what had once been Rome, had survived invasions, revolts, and earthquakes, but it could not escape the slow crushing weight of famine and plague. Emperor Justinian had dreamed of restoring the old Roman world. He sent armies to conquer Italy and North Africa, built the Hagia Sophia to show divine favour, and filled Constantinople with marble and gold. But all the monuments in the world couldn't save an empire when its people were starving and dying faster than they could be replaced. The plague had taken soldiers from the front lines, farmers from their fields, and merchants from their markets. Tax revenues collapsed because there were no workers left to pay them. Ships rotted in harbours. Mines closed. Even the coinage grew smaller and cheaper as the empire struggled to hold itself together. Officials wrote letters begging the emperor for help, but Justinian had nothing left to give. The once glorious capital began to shrink, its great walls guarding more ghosts than citizens. To the east, the Sasanian Empire faced the same fate. Their lands, stretching from modern Iran to Mesopotamia, had been powerful rivals of Byzantium for centuries. Now they were wasting away. The cold weather and crop failures hit the fertile valleys of the Tigris and Euphrates hard. Floods ruined fields that famine had already weakened. When the plague arrived, it tore through the cities of Ctesiphon and Seleucia, killing nobles, priests, and soldiers alike. Armies melted away without battles. Fields lay abandoned. The royal court raised taxes to survive, but there was no one left to pay. Entire provinces rebelled or simply vanished into silence. Both empires were so weakened that neither could defend their borders. Bandits and raiders moved freely. Former Roman lands in Italy and Spain fell into chaos as Gothic warlords fought for scraps of territory. In Britain, whatever was left of Roman order disappeared completely, replaced by small kingdoms clinging to survival. Across Europe, abandoned towns became forests again, roads crumbled, bridges collapsed, and the stone ruins of bathhouses and theatres stood as reminders of a civilization that had forgotten how to build. The people who lived through it didn't call it the Dark Ages, but that is what it became. Darkness wasn't just in the sky. It was in every part of life. Governments failed, laws lost their meaning, trade routes turned into dangerous paths haunted by thieves. For the first time in centuries, local leaders and warlords mattered more than emperors. The world had fractured into smaller pieces, each fighting to hold on. The dream of empire had turned into the struggle to survive. By the year 550, the Byzantine and Sasanian empires were still standing on paper, but in truth they were hollow. Their cities were half empty, their fields half dead, their people exhausted. They had faced the greatest natural disasters in history, and nature had won. When the sky went dark and the world began to freeze, people searched for meaning. They didn't have science to explain volcanic ash or climate collapse. All they knew was that the sun, the one thing that had always risen and set, was now weak and strange. To them, this couldn't be natural. It had to be a sign. Across Europe, Asia, and Africa, people began to look for messages in the heavens. When the air turned grey and the stars grew faint, it felt like a warning. Priests spoke of judgment. Prophets claimed that the end of days had arrived. Farmers stopped planting and started praying. In the absence of answers, belief became the only form of control left. The darkness seemed to make the supernatural feel closer, as if the veil between the human world and something greater had thinned. Stories spread of saints who could heal the sick and of sorcerers who could summon light from the ashes. Some people lit candles in churches all day and all night, trying to keep the sun alive through imitation. Others turned to old pagan rituals, burying offerings in frozen soil or carving symbols into trees to beg the earth for mercy. When the world feels like it's ending, faith becomes a survival tool. It gives shape to chaos. It gives people something to do when they can't fix what's broken. But faith can also become a weapon. As famine deepened, communities began to look for someone to blame. In cities, from Constantinople to Antioch, whispers spread that heretics and foreigners had angered the heavens. In the countryside, rumours claimed that witches had cursed the land. Fear turned neighbours into enemies. Trials and purges followed, each one a desperate attempt to make sense of the suffering. The belief that someone must be responsible for the darkness brought more death than the famine itself. Yet even amid the fear, belief also gave people strength. Monks wrote that visions of glowing crosses appeared in the night sky. Pilgrims claimed to see the Virgin Mary walking through the fields of snow, protecting those who still had faith. Miracles became stories of hope, told to children who had never seen a bright summer. In Ireland, Monks recorded that fasting and prayer could bring the return of sunlight. In China, astrologers studied the heavens and warned the emperor that the cosmic balance had been disturbed. Everywhere, people tried to find meaning in the dim light above them. They built temples, shrines, and altars, not just for gods, but for stability, for the feeling that someone was still listening. The human mind cannot survive endless chaos without a story to explain it, and so belief filled the void where reason could not reach. Saints and sorcerers became symbols of resistance against a world that had turned cold. Every prayer, every ritual, every omen was an act of defiance, a way of saying that even if the sun had lost its power, the human spirit had not. Far to the north, where the winters were already long and the summers short, the darkness of the 6th century hit like a hammer. In Scandinavia and the lands around the Baltic Sea, people lived close to the edge even in good years. They farmed thin soil, fished icy waters, and hunted in dense forests. When the sun dimmed after the year 536, those fragile systems collapsed almost overnight. The sky turned grey, and snow fell in summer. The crops that had once grown for a few precious months never ripened. Livestock died from cold and hunger. The forests that had once given life became silent. To the people of the north, it must have felt like the gods themselves had abandoned them. Archaeologists today can still read the story written in the trees. In the rings of ancient pines and oaks, the years of darkness stand out like scars. Around 536, the rings become thin, showing almost no growth. The pattern continues for nearly a decade, proof that the cold never truly lifted. In this time, entire villages vanished. Burial sites stop appearing in the record, as if whole families had been wiped out. In Sweden, Denmark, and Norway, signs of the old ruling class disappear. Rich graves, filled with gold and weapons, are suddenly replaced by nothing. The elites who had ruled through wealth and war were gone, perhaps starved, perhaps overthrown, perhaps simply erased by the collapse of everything that kept them in power. The silence spreads across the north. Cult sites that had been centers of worship for centuries fall quiet. The great stone circles where people once sacrificed to their gods stand empty. The ancient carvings of ships and sun symbols stop being made, as if people no longer believed the sun was listening. Myths from later centuries may carry echoes of this trauma. Norse legends speak of Fimbulwinter, the endless winter that comes before the end of the world. It describes 3 years of cold, darkness, and death, followed by the final battle of Ragnarok, when the sun is swallowed and the world burns. Maybe those stories began as memories of this time, passed down from survivors who saw the sky go black and believed they had lived through the beginning of the end. Trade across the Baltic Sea broke down. Amber, which had once been shipped to the Mediterranean, stopped moving. Settlements along the coasts were abandoned. Even the sea itself froze in places it never had before. For a generation, life in the north was a fight against extinction, and yet, somehow, a few survived. Small groups held on near the coasts where fish could still be caught, or in sheltered valleys where springs kept running even through the cold. From those survivors, new communities slowly grew centuries later. The Viking world that would one day rise came from the ashes of this frozen silence. The black sun had nearly erased them, but it also forged the toughness that would define the people of the north for centuries to come. At the western edge of the known world, the islands of Britain and Ireland were already places of isolation when the darkness began. The Roman Empire had withdrawn more than a century before, leaving behind crumbling walls and scattered towns surrounded by wild countryside. Small kingdoms had risen in their place, fragile and often at war. But when the sky dimmed after the year 536, even the strongest of them found themselves powerless. The monks who kept records in their stone monasteries wrote of a world turned grey. Their annals speak of failing harvests and bread that grew scarce. They described years when frost lay on the ground in midsummer, and when the seas raged as if the world itself were sick. In Ireland, one record simply reads the failure of bread from the year 536 to 539. That short line captures an entire generation's suffering. For people living on the edge of Europe, the darkness meant more than hunger. It meant separation. The few trade routes that still connected the islands to the continent fell silent. The ships that once brought wine, grain, and metal from France and Spain stopped arriving. The harbours filled with seaweed and wreckage. Inland, farmers abandoned fields that no longer produced crops and moved toward the coasts where fishing might still feed them. The cold seas became their only hope. Even monasteries, once centres of learning and stability, struggled to survive. Their gardens froze, their stores of grain ran low, yet it was the monks who preserved the memory of this age. By candlelight, they copied prayers, poems, and fragments of history, while the wind howled through their stone halls. In those dark years, faith and writing were acts of resistance. England was not yet one country. It was a patchwork of small kingdoms divided by language and tribe. In the south, Saxon settlers were carving out new lands. In the north and west, old Celtic kingdoms held on. The dim years pushed them all to their limits. Some villages vanished from history. Others became fortresses of survival, places where people gathered together to share what little food remained. Migration became common. Families left their homes searching for warmth and safety, travelling along the old Roman roads now broken and overgrown. Those who reached new lands often found them already claimed, leading to conflict and war over the smallest patches of fertile ground. But even in the chaos, endurance became its own kind of story. The monks wrote of miracles, of candles that burned through endless nights, of communities that rebuilt after the frost. For every village that fell silent, another somehow endured. The people of the Isles had faced invasions and storms before, but nothing like this. The darkness stripped away everything except willpower. By the time the skies began to clear years later, the islands that had once been broken were slowly becoming something new. Out of famine and cold came the seeds of new kingdoms, built by those who refused to disappear into the fog at the edge of the world. Across the vast heart of Eurasia, where grasslands stretch beyond the horizon and deserts shimmer under the sun, the darkness of the 6th century came with its own rhythm of disaster. The Silk Road had long been the lifeline of continents, a web of caravans and traders carrying silk, spices, gold, and ideas between the Mediterranean and China. When the sun dimmed after the year 536, that web began to unravel. The skies above the steppes turned grey. The grass that fed herds of horses and camels withered. Rivers froze earlier and stayed frozen longer. Nomadic tribes who depended on grazing lands suddenly found their animals dying in droves. Without livestock, they lost their food, their trade goods, and their way of life. Migration followed, but migration meant conflict. Tribes moved south and west in search of new pastures, colliding with others who were just as desperate. The endless plains that had once connected cultures now became battlefields of survival. Farther east, in Central Asia and China, the cold brought more than hunger. It brought chaos. Chinese records from the Northern Wei dynasty describe strange weather, failed harvests, and entire provinces struck by famine. The imperial court tried to send relief, but even the capital was running short of food. Rebellions broke out as starving farmers abandoned their land. The dynasty fractured under the pressure, and power shifted from one warlord to another. The political map of China blurred and redrew itself in blood and desperation. Every part of the Silk Road felt the shock. In Persia, the Sasanian Empire struggled to keep its trade routes open as its own fields failed. In the oases of Central Asia, where caravans once stopped to rest and trade, markets turned into ghost towns. Merchants refused to travel. Bandits prowled the empty roads. The silk that once linked the world sat useless in storehouses because no one could afford it. The same roads that had once carried wealth now carried disease. When the plague that began in Egypt spread eastward, it travelled along these same routes, following the paths of refugees and traders. It reached Central Asia within years, infecting towns that had already been hollowed out by famine. The connection that once made the ancient world rich now made it sick. The steppe empires that had risen and fallen for centuries found themselves powerless against a foe they could neither see nor fight. The great khaganates and confederations dissolved into scattered tribes. The desert swallowed their camps, and the wind erased their trails. Yet even in this collapse, something was being forged. New groups learned to adapt to the changing world. They moved with the seasons, learned new routes, and traded in new ways. A few centuries later, their descendants would rebuild the Silk Road stronger than before. But in the 6th century, the steppe and the sand were silent. The caravans were gone. The sound of camel bells had faded into the wind, replaced by the quiet of a continent trying to survive under a pale, broken Sunday. In Africa, the great darkness of the 6th century was felt in ways both familiar and hidden. The continent that had always been a cradle of life and trade began to feel the weight of a changing world. Along the Nile, where civilization had flourished for thousands of years, the rhythm of the river broke. The floods that came each year to water the fields were no longer predictable. Some years the river rose too high, drowning crops and washing away villages. Other years it failed completely, leaving fields cracked and dry under a grey sky. The Nile had always been Egypt's heartbeat. When it faltered, everything else did too. Farmers waited for the water that never came. Granaries emptied. Priests, who once promised divine order, stood before desperate crowds with no answers. Across the Red Sea, the trade routes that connected Africa to Arabia and the wider world began to tremble. The ports of Aksum, in what is now Ethiopia and Eritrea, had been thriving centres of commerce. Ivory, gold, and frankincense flowed through their markets, traded for silk, glass, and spices from Asia. But when the skies darkened and harvests failed, ships stopped coming. The empire that had once ruled the highlands and the coasts began to shrink. Its coins, once minted in gold, were now struck in bronze, a sign that wealth and confidence were fading. Archaeologists can trace the decline in the layers of soil left behind, a slow retreat of human life from once busy places. Farther inland, pastoralists faced their own trials. Herds that had sustained entire cultures began to die as the grasslands dried up. Cattle weakened without water. Nomadic groups moved in search of greener pastures, sometimes clashing with neighbouring tribes over scarce resources. Old alliances broke down. Some communities turned inward, guarding their wells and grazing lands. Others adapted, moving deeper into forested regions or turning to trade and craftsmanship to survive. The crisis connected the continent in unexpected ways. From the deserts of the north to the savannas of the south, the same pattern played out. When the rains failed, famine followed. When famine came, people moved. Migration reshaped the map of Africa, just as it did in Europe and Asia. Oral traditions, passed down through generations, still speak of years when the sun was weak, when the harvests failed, and when families walked for days to find food. These stories remember hunger as both a teacher and a warning. The Red Sea became quieter, its waters carrying fewer ships, but it also became a refuge for some. Traders and sailors who could no longer live by the land turned to the sea, connecting small communities along its coasts. Even in crisis, people found ways to adapt. The shadows that fell over Africa were part of a global catastrophe, yet the continent endured. It bent but did not break. The Nile would rise again, the rains would return, and when they did, new kingdoms and cultures would grow from the survivors of those dark years, carrying with them the memory of the time when even the sun forgot to shine. Starvation changes everything. It starts quietly, a dull ache in the stomach that people try to ignore, believing food will come tomorrow. But in the 6th century, tomorrow kept coming and nothing changed. The grain stores were empty. The markets had nothing to sell. Families began eating whatever they could find: bark, grass, boiled roots. Hunger rewired the body and the mind. Muscles wasted away. The skin thinned and clung to bone. Faces grew hollow. Children stopped growing. Even the smallest cuts became deadly because the body could no longer heal. When starvation takes hold, the mind starts to slip. People dream about food they will never taste again. They imagine smells that aren't there. The hunger becomes a kind of madness. In towns and villages across Europe, Asia, and Africa, people mixed whatever they could into flour to stretch it further. Dust, crushed leaves, powdered bark. Bread that had once been golden and soft became grey and bitter. Some baked loaves with clay and ash, knowing it would fill their stomachs for a few hours, even if it poisoned them later. Monks wrote of people collapsing in the fields, with handfuls of grass still in their mouths. The line between human and animal began to blur as survival became the only law. When food disappeared, so did kindness. Hunger made people desperate. Neighbours who had once shared tools or stories began to guard their homes like fortresses. The few who had food hid it or fled. Entire families left their villages in search of better land. But the famine stretched everywhere. The roads were lined with people walking slowly, too weak to speak. Mothers carried children who would not wake. In the cities, starvation turned into chaos. Crowds gathered outside granaries demanding grain that no longer existed. Soldiers tried to control them, but often joined in when their rations ran out. Food riots erupted in places like Constantinople, Alexandria, and Antioch. Markets were looted. Bakers were attacked. The physics of desperation took over, the way hunger spreads through a crowd until reason breaks. People who had been calm one day became violent the next. But famine also revealed something strange about humanity. Even in the worst hunger, some still shared what little they had. In monasteries, monks gave away their last loaves to the poor. In small villages, people took turns cooking watery soups that barely kept them alive. The instinct to help did not disappear completely. It just struggled to survive beside fear. Scientists today know that famine doesn't just kill through hunger. It weakens immunity, making disease spread faster. It drives migration, spreading chaos farther. It leaves long scars on survivors. Children born during famine grow up smaller, weaker, and more prone to illness. But what no science can measure is the silence it leaves behind. After years of starvation, even when food returns, people never eat the same way again. They learn to ration, to hoard, to fear the empty bowl. The famine of the 6th century didn't just destroy bodies. It changed how entire generations understood survival. Disease follows hunger like a shadow. It always has. When famine takes hold, bodies weaken, immune systems fail, and the smallest infection becomes deadly. After the cold years of the 6th century, the world was already fragile. People were starving, moving, and desperate. Then came the plague. What happened next wasn't random. It was the math of survival breaking down. When food disappears, so does order. Families migrate, villages scatter, and cities overflow with refugees. That movement is what disease loves. Crowded spaces, poor sanitation, shared water, all perfect conditions for microbes to spread. The people of the 6th century didn't understand bacteria or fleas or rats, but they could see the pattern. Where hunger went, sickness followed. In Egypt, traders watched ships filled with grain sail into ports, while rats crept aboard with something invisible. The bacteria Yersinia pestis travelled with them, the same germ that would later cause the Black Death centuries later. Once it reached humans, it exploded. Fever, black boils, death within days. The Justinianic plague began its terrible math. One infected rat could carry hundreds of fleas. Each flea could bite dozens of people. Each person could infect many more. Within months, the numbers grew beyond counting. Constantinople became a city of graves. Historians wrote that carts could not keep up with the dead. But it wasn't just the cities. The countryside was hit too. Malnourished farmers, already weak from years of failed harvests, had no resistance. Famine and plague worked together, feeding off each other in a cruel partnership. Hunger made disease stronger, and disease made hunger worse. Fields were left unploughed because there were no workers left to till them. Animals starved because no one was alive to feed them. The cycle tightened like a noose. In simple terms, every disaster amplified the next. Climate change caused crop failure. Crop failure caused famine. Famine caused migration. Migration caused plague. And plague finished what hunger started. It was a chain reaction of collapse, an equation that ended with silence. Some historians estimate that between 1/3 and 1/2 of the people in the eastern Mediterranean died. In some regions, whole communities vanished. The survivors lived among ruins and ghosts. Scientists studying ancient DNA have found traces of the plague buried in human teeth from across Europe, confirming how far and fast it spread. What's striking is how familiar the pattern is. Even in the modern world, disease still follows disruption. When war, drought, or poverty displaces people, microbes move with them. The 6th century was one of the first times this global pattern became clear. The same conditions that make civilization possible, trade and travel and dense cities, can also make it fragile. The people of that age couldn't stop the plague, but their story explains why it spread. It wasn't punishment or bad luck. It was the natural consequence of a planet out of balance, a grim equation written in hunger, cold, and fear, proving that when nature collapses, everything else collapses with it. Imagine a small village somewhere in Europe around the year 540. The sky is still pale and strange, the air colder than it should be. In one of the huts, a girl named Livia wakes to the sound of her mother grinding bark into powder. They mix it with the last handful of rye to make bread. It tastes bitter, but there is nothing else. The fields outside their home haven't grown a full harvest in years. The stream that once ran clear is now a trickle. Livia used to play with other children, but most of them are gone, carried away by fever or hunger. She doesn't understand why the sun looks weak or why her father's hands shake when he talks about next winter. All she knows is that every day feels colder and longer. To her, survival is not an idea. It's the act of finding something, anything, to eat. A few hundred miles away, in a monastery perched on a windswept hill, a man named Brother Marcus keeps a journal. He is a monk and a physician of sorts, trained to mix herbs and offer prayers for the sick. He has stopped counting how many people he has buried this year. The monks ring the bell for the dead so often that its sound no longer surprises anyone. Marcus writes by candlelight that the air smells of decay, that every illness spreads faster than before. He believes the world is being tested by God, but even his faith wavers. He has begun recording what he sees: the swelling in the necks, the dark spots on the skin, the sudden collapse of strong men. He doesn't know the word plague, but he knows despair. His hands shake as he writes that even the holy water seems powerless. In the ports of the eastern Mediterranean, a grain merchant named Theon tries to keep his business alive. Once, his ships carried wheat and barley from Egypt to Constantinople. Now the docks are nearly empty. The plague has taken most of his sailors, and the ones who remain refuse to leave port. They whisper that the sea itself is cursed. Theon stares at his ledgers filled with debts that can never be paid. Every trade partner he knew is either dead or ruined. He walks through markets where the air is silent, and the only movement comes from stray dogs. He knows that if his ships don't sail, people will starve, yet he cannot risk losing the last of his crew. Each of these people lives in the same world, but their experiences form different pieces of the same tragedy. Livia's hunger, Marcus's fear, and Theon's ruin are not separate stories. They are reflections of how catastrophe feels when it touches real lives. History remembers dates and empires, but the truth of the dim years lives in people like them. In the faces of children who forgot what full bellies felt like, in the hands of monks who wrote to keep hope alive, and in the silence of merchants watching the world's economy fall apart, one life at a time. Recovery, after the catastrophe, did not come with a sunrise or a celebration. It came slowly, so slowly that most people living through it never realized it had begun. The years of darkness and plague had left behind a quieter world. Forests began to creep back into places where fields once stood. Trees grew over forgotten villages and ancient roads. The sounds of axes and ploughs faded, replaced by birdsong and wind. What had once been farmland turned into wilderness again. Nature was reclaiming what humans had lost. Populations that had been shattered started to rise, but not evenly. In some valleys, new families built homes from the ruins of old ones. In others, nothing returned for generations. Survival had been so difficult for so long that people no longer trusted the future. They planted cautiously, saved every seed, and watched the sky with suspicion. The climate began to warm again, but slowly. Summers grew longer, crops began to yield. Children born in this new world had no memory of the grey sun or the endless winters. To them, the world had always been this way, green and quiet, the ruins of stone cities just strange old hills covered in moss. In the Mediterranean, coins began to circulate again. The economy that had collapsed started to breathe. At first, it was local, a village trading grain for cloth, a fisherman swapping his catch for salt. But little by little, merchants returned to the roads and harbours. Markets reopened, though smaller than before. Governments tried to rebuild what had been lost. The Byzantine Empire reminted its coinage and reformed its taxes, desperate to bring order back to a population that had learned to live without it. Across Europe, small kingdoms rose from the ashes of the old empires, built not on grandeur, but on endurance. Recovery wasn't a single event. It was a chain of quiet acts repeated by millions of people who refused to stop living. A blacksmith teaching his son to work iron again. A farmer ploughing a field that had been empty for 30 years. A child born healthy after a generation of sickness. These moments didn't make headlines or enter chronicles, but they were history in motion. The forests that had grown thick during the catastrophe became resources again. Timber built ships and homes. The same wilderness that once symbolized abandonment now became the key to renewal. Slowly, trade returned, connecting communities that had been isolated for decades. The world was not the same as before. It was smaller, simpler, humbler, but it was alive again. By the year 600, enough generations had passed that the worst memories had turned into legends. The years of darkness became stories told by firelight, warnings about hunger and humility. Humanity had survived the unthinkable and was learning once more how to build, how to trade, and how to trust. The Sunday recovery was not glorious. It was fragile and uneven. But it was real. Life had found its rhythm again, proving that even after the longest night, the world remembers how to heal. The darkness of the 6th century eventually faded from the sky, but it never truly left the human mind. People carried it forward in stories, songs, and symbols long after the cold years had ended. The trauma of watching the sun fail, of burying loved ones, of seeing entire villages vanish, became something larger than memory. It turned into myth. Across Europe and Asia, cultures began telling stories about a time when the world went dim. In the north, the Norse spoke of Fimbulwinter, the endless winter that comes before the end of the world. In the east, Chinese records told of strange eclipses and hungry ghosts wandering the land. Even in Christian writings, the idea of divine judgment became stronger. The world had already felt like it had ended once, and people couldn't shake the fear that it could happen again. These stories weren't just superstition. They were a way of explaining what had happened, a form of therapy for societies that didn't have words for trauma. When the sun dimmed, people thought heaven had turned against them. When it returned, they promised never to forget. But humans rarely remember through facts. They remember through meaning. Myths turned the disaster into a lesson about humility, faith, and endurance. Monks and priests began preaching that suffering was the path to purity. The rise of ascetic movements, where people renounced comfort and lived in hardship, echoed the memory of the famine years. It was as if the world had been taught that plenty was dangerous, that only by living simply could disaster be kept away. In literature, you can still feel the shadow of those years. Poems and prayers from the 7th century speak of light as a gift and darkness as punishment. The sun became a symbol of divine mercy. Every sunrise was a small miracle. The collective memory of the catastrophe shaped how people saw nature and fate. In many places, rituals changed. Harvest festivals added prayers for light and warmth. Candlelight ceremonies became sacred acts, reminders that even in darkness, humans could create their own glow. In the Eastern Mediterranean, stories of saints surviving famine and plague became popular, blending history and miracle until they were impossible to separate. These legends gave people heroes to look up to, figures who endured what they themselves had endured only generations before. The fear of another dark age never fully left. Even centuries later, when skies dimmed from volcanic eruptions or eclipses, people panicked, believing the end had returned. The world had learned to associate the fading of the sun with moral failure, with judgment. Yet beneath the fear, there was also hope. The same myths that spoke of destruction also promised renewal. In the Norse sagas, after the long winter and the final battle, the sun's daughter rises to light a new world. In Christian visions, after tribulation comes paradise. The memory of the 6th century darkness was carried forward not just as a warning, but as a quiet promise that even after the world falls apart, light always returns. When historians talk about the worst times to be alive, a few moments always rise to the top of the list. The 14th century Black Death killed at least 1/3 of Europe's population. The 30 Years' War in the 17th century left Central Europe burned and empty. The influenza pandemic of 1918 spread faster than any disease before it, killing millions in a matter of months. Colonial famines in the 19th century turned entire regions into graveyards. Each of these eras brought its own kind of apocalypse. But even among them, the years between 536 and 550 stand apart. The difference is scale and silence. Most disasters strike in one form: a war, a plague, a famine. The 6th century gave humanity all three at once. The world's climate shifted almost overnight. The sun dimmed, crops failed. Empires starved. Then the plague arrived to finish what the cold had begun. It wasn't just the number of deaths, though those were immense. It was the total collapse of normality. People everywhere felt the same confusion and fear, from Ireland to China. In the 14th century, the Black Death was horrifying but brief. It burned through the world and was gone within a few years. Life eventually rebounded. The 30 Years' War was brutal but localized. The influenza of 1918 killed faster than anything before it, but the modern world recovered in a decade. The 6th century disaster lasted more than 100 years before the planet truly stabilized. For generations, there was no sense of safety. Children grew up never seeing a normal summer. Entire civilizations lost memory of what prosperity looked like. The scale of disconnection was global in a time before globalization even existed. The Black Death happened in a world that could still write, paint, and record its grief. The 6th century darkness erased voices. There are fewer written records because entire populations of scribes and monks died. Archaeology tells the story instead through tree rings that stop growing, through pollen layers that vanish, through coins that suddenly disappear from circulation. Nature itself keeps the archive of that age because humanity nearly lost the ability to do so. What makes the mid-6th century unique is that it wasn't just human tragedy, it was environmental transformation. The earth itself became hostile. The Black Death came and went, but the sky never dimmed. The 30 Years' War destroyed armies, not agriculture across continents. The year 536 marked the point when the planet seemed to turn against its own inhabitants. The combination of volcanic winters, famine, and plague made recovery feel impossible. For nearly 2 centuries afterward, the human population of Europe, the Middle East, and Asia remained far smaller than before. The world took almost 500 years to rebuild to its previous strength. So, when historians call it the worst time to be alive, they aren't exaggerating. It was a moment when survival meant defying both nature and fate, when the line between history and extinction was measured in a few stubborn generations who refused to disappear. For centuries, the dark years of the 6th century were little more than rumour. Medieval writers spoke of a time when the sun failed, when crops died and empires fell, but their words sounded like legend. It wasn't until modern science began to dig into the ice, the trees, and even human DNA that the truth came into focus. Today, we can read the past the way we read a book, one frozen layer at a time. Deep in the ice of Greenland and Antarctica, scientists drill cores that hold the planet's memory. Each layer captures a year of snowfall, trapping bits of dust, gas, and ash. Around the layer for the year 536, something incredible appears. Sulfur, huge amounts of it, enough to prove that massive volcanic eruptions had pumped ash into the upper atmosphere, blocking sunlight for years. Ice cores from both hemispheres show matching spikes, meaning the eruptions were global, not local. One volcano likely erupted in the northern hemisphere around 500–36, followed by another in 540 and a third a few years later. These explosions dimmed the sun and cooled the earth by several degrees, enough to ruin harvests across continents. For the first time, science could confirm what ancient people had witnessed. The sun really had lost its power. Tree rings tell the same story. In forests from Ireland to Siberia, the rings that mark yearly growth shrink dramatically right after 536. Some trees barely grew at all. It is a biological signature of a cold, dark world. These rings give scientists a year-by-year calendar of climate collapse, showing that the dim period lasted more than a decade. Then there is tephra, the fine volcanic glass that settles after eruptions. Traces of it have been found in ice cores and soil layers in Europe, Asia, and North America. Chemical testing links it to volcanoes in Iceland and possibly Central America, suggesting that multiple eruptions might have worked together to plunge the planet into shadow. Even human genomes hold evidence of what happened next. Genetic studies show that populations across Europe and Asia suddenly contracted during this period, a biological echo of famine and plague. By studying ancient DNA extracted from skeletons, scientists can identify the presence of Yersinia pestis, the bacterium responsible for the Justinianic plague. Its genetic fingerprint appears in burials dating exactly to the years after 541, confirming the timing of the second disaster that followed the first. Together, these clues create a picture clearer than any ancient text. The Earth's own archives have settled what history only guessed at. The darkness was real, it was global, and it nearly ended the human story. Science, in a way, became the new chronicle, one that speaks through ice, stone, and bone instead of ink. It tells us that the past isn't lost. It's written everywhere, waiting for someone to learn how to read it. What made the 6th century so deadly wasn't just one event, it was how everything went wrong at once. The world's systems, both natural and human, were already fragile, and when one piece failed, it pulled all the others down with it. The first shock came from the sky. Volcanic eruptions filled the atmosphere with ash, cooling the planet and blocking sunlight. Crops withered, rivers froze, and the rhythm of the seasons broke. Famine followed, spreading faster than any army could move. Hungry people left their villages, crowding into cities that were already short on food. That movement created perfect conditions for disease. When the plague finally arrived, it found the world prepared to die. Every disaster fed the next. Scientists call it a feedback loop. For the people who lived through it, it just felt like the end of everything. Geography played its part too. The most populated regions of the 6th century world were tightly connected by trade routes. The same ships that carried grain also carried fleas and rats. The same roads that brought soldiers to defend borders carried refugees and sickness in the other direction. Empires like Byzantium and Persia depended on far-flung provinces for food and tax revenue. When one region collapsed, the shock rippled through the whole system. A bad harvest in Egypt could mean empty markets in Constantinople and riots in Syria. There was no safety net, no way to isolate failure. The world was connected, but without resilience. Leadership made things worse. Emperor Justinian ruled at a time when people needed stability, but his ambitions stretched his empire thin. He spent vast resources on war and monumental architecture, while the countryside starved. His armies spread the plague as they moved across the Mediterranean, unknowingly carrying death to every port they reached. The Persian kings faced their own crises, trying to hold their empire together as famine drained their strength. Leaders who had built systems of power around control found themselves powerless against nature. The tyranny of geography was inescapable. Most people lived in river valleys and coastal plains where climate change hit hardest. When the rains failed or the cold deepened, they had nowhere to go. Mountain ranges, deserts, and seas cut off escape. Those who fled only brought hunger and disease with them. Every solution created a new problem. The collapse wasn't caused by one bad year, but by the way the world kept amplifying its own suffering. Each shock left people weaker, poorer, and more exposed to the next. By the time recovery was possible, the old world was gone. The lesson hidden in those centuries is simple but terrifying. Civilization is not destroyed by a single event. It is undone by feedback, by one system failing and dragging the rest with it. In the 6th century, humanity learned what happens when the planet itself becomes part of that loop. It wasn't just a time of darkness. It was a demonstration of how fragile the web of life and society really is when the balance breaks, and nothing can stop the chain reaction. When scientists study the 6th century, they are not just looking into the past, they are looking into a mirror. The people who lived through the years of darkness didn't know what was happening to them, but their story feels strangely familiar now. They watched their climate shift, their food systems fail, and their trust in leaders collapse. They faced rumors, false prophecies, and fear spreading faster than facts. It sounds like a world that could happen again. The difference is that today we know what is happening to our planet, but knowledge alone is not enough. Climate change is the opposite of the 6th century cold. The Earth is warming instead of freezing, yet the effects are similar. Droughts, floods, and failed harvests are reshaping entire regions. Crops that once grew easily now struggle under heat. Supply chains that feed billions can break with just a few bad seasons. We like to think modern technology protects us, but our systems are still as fragile as those of the ancient world, just bigger and more complex. When one part fails, it can ripple across the globe in days instead of years. In the 6th century, famine brought disease. The same danger exists now. As the climate warms, pathogens are finding new ways to spread. Melting ice and shifting animal habitats expose humans to microbes they have never encountered before. The COVID pandemic showed how quickly a single infection can reach every continent. History tells us that when hunger, migration, and sickness combine, chaos follows. But it also shows us what prevents total collapse: cooperation. In the dark centuries, the communities that survived were the ones that shared, that built networks of trust when everything else fell apart. The same rule holds today. Global problems can only be solved together. No country can wall itself off from climate or disease. The ancient world teaches what happens when people stop working together and turn inward. Collapse is not a single moment. It is a failure of connection. Another lesson from the 6th century is about information. When the sun dimmed, people filled the silence with superstition. Fear spread through stories faster than truth. We still do the same, but now our myths travel at the speed of the internet. Misinformation about science, food, and climate weakens our ability to respond. The lesson is not just about avoiding panic. It is about protecting truth as a survival tool. The 6th century showed that humans can endure incredible suffering and still rebuild, but only when they act together and adapt faster than disaster grows. We are facing a different kind of dimming now, not of the sun, but of foresight. The warning from the past is clear. Nature does not forgive delay. Cooperation and preparation are the only real defenses. The people who survived the cold centuries did not do it by luck. They did it by learning to trust, to share, and to see beyond their own lifetimes. The same will decide whether we survive the centuries ahead. At first, no one noticed that the light was returning. The sun had been dim for so long that people had stopped looking for it. But slowly, almost shyly, the world began to change. The mornings grew warmer, the snow melted sooner, seeds planted in trembling hope began to sprout again. Fields that had been grey and dead for a generation turned green. Rivers ran full and clear. The survivors of the dark century stepped out from ruins and saw a world that was still broken but alive. It must have felt like waking from a long nightmare. For decades, people had lived only to endure. Now, they could finally begin to live again. In small villages, the sound of bells returned. They rang for harvests, for weddings, for newborns. Life was cautious at first, but it was life. In Constantinople, markets reopened. Traders filled the docks again, their sails white against the blue sea. In the countryside, farmers built new homes with stones taken from the ruins of the old. The scars of famine and plague didn't disappear, but they became part of the story rather than the end of it. A child born in the year 600 would have grown up hearing tales of the darkness as something distant, almost mythical. For them, the world was filled with light, not fear. The forests that had reclaimed the land were now full of game. The soil, rested by years of abandonment, was rich again. Nature, in its own slow rhythm, had healed itself, and humanity followed. The people who rebuilt the world were descendants of survivors, carrying in their bones the memory of endurance. They were tougher, more adaptable, and more aware of how fragile life could be. That awareness shaped the centuries that followed. Religion grew deeper, communities became stronger. Every sunrise carried meaning. The world that emerged was not the same as the one that had fallen, but in many ways it was wiser. Even the art and music of later generations carried traces of that hard-earned gratitude. Stories of light returning became common across cultures. Legends spoke of heroes who brought back the sun, of gods who ended the long winter, of people who refused to give up. These weren't just myths. They were memory disguised as hope. The world had gone through midnight and found dawn waiting on the other side. Looking back now, It is almost impossible to imagine what it felt like to live through a century when the sun seemed to fail. But we live in the proof that humanity did not end there. Every field of wheat, every city skyline, every laugh and voice on this planet traces its ancestry to those who survived the cold years. The year 536 was the darkest noon in history, but it wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of a lesson written across all time. However long the night lasts, dawn always comes, and humanity always remembers how to rise.